gentlemen.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning, everybody. Hello. Special hello to the front row people. Hello, front row people. It's great to be back here. Mr. Deputy Mayor, it's so good. If you're an Atlantic editor and going to do a takedown story on the management of Chicago, what would you start with?
Wow. A takedown, in other words, a negative story?
Well,
which of course you would never do. But if you were to do that,
I'm putting you in my shoes.
I think, look, I think Chicago is, first of all, let me start by good morning, everybody. Welcome to Chicago. For those of you who aren't here, we appreciate your being here. You're helping the economy, so that's a good thing.
Yes.
Hope you stay.
And thank you. And so back to the bad things.
Yes, so back to the bad things. I think Chicago has the same set of issues that most big northern industrial cities in America do. Some we have worse, some we have better. We have many assets. We've got, all of the social pressures that have come about over the last 30, 40 years, and they seem to be, I think, reaching a crescendo right now. And if you look at, sort of the big central issues that a city faces, and if you think about the critical things that are part of somebody's life, education, public safety, economic opportunity, and I think those are sort of the big urban issues of our time. We have great strengths, we have some weaknesses, but I think in the end we have the same set of issues that almost every city faces, and the real question is how does each confront them and who does a better job addressing those challenges in this particular era.
This is a city maker summit, and it occurs to me you have one of the most interesting backgrounds of a deputy mayor, because you were not sort of a permanent civil servant of the bureaucracy that rose up. You were sort of a Donald Trump-like guy. It's on the cover story.
That's what people tell me.
You come out of M&A, you did global M&A.
I read this last night. Yeah. For those of you who haven't read it, it's a little bit scary. It's a little scary. The mind of Donald Trump, which we've wondered what that is.
Right.
But it's an odd psychological profile that I hope no one ever does on me, because God knows.
We'll
My
take
mother
that under
could do
advisement.
that. Yeah.
40% of the audience is for Donald Trump, 40% is for Hillary, and 20% is unsure. Or maybe 20% is for Bernie, and then another 20%.
You're in Chicago. Nobody
in any case,
admits to being a Republican.
But I guess the question I want to pose is, one of the things that Trump talks a lot about is basically redoing deals, negotiating deals differently, negotiating debt differently. And I'm interested in your experience as an M&A guy who merged things together, who bought assets and who get rid of assets.
Yeah.
What of those skills are relevant running a city like Chicago with so many legacy and stranded costs that are hard to just shake off?
Well, I think on one level, it's an incredibly naive, narrow, and somewhat silly view of government and of governance. And on another level, I think there are some skills there, that at least the kernel of skills that are useful and productive. And let me parse that out. I think on the skill level, I don't think it's necessarily out of a business background or a deal background, whatever that is, that you get this, but I think there are various backgrounds that tend to give you analytical skills, an ability to look at things dispassionately, an ability to sort of understand the core underlying set of issues that might be driving a problem. And those are very useful. They could come out of a lifetime of government, they could come out of a lifetime in business, they might come out of somebody who I guess was a real estate developer, maybe. But I think there's a set of skills that are going to be useful that are a component of what goes into successful governance. I've been doing this not that long, about 3.5 years, and I think my own sort of experience has been that the difference of a public life as opposed to a private is the sort of level of complexity is amped up to a very high degree. Just multiple layers of constituencies and complexity that go into public decision making that really aren't part of even the most complicated of business situations. If I think about the most complicated transactions I ever worked on, and I spent 30 plus years doing this, so had all kinds of different things like that, you still had relatively defined sets of constituencies, defined sets of problems that each of them had, And as a general matter, you could address most of those, and that's what led to a successful transaction. The difference in, I think, the public sector is there tend to be winners and losers. There tend to be people who aren't going to be satisfied, particularly in many issues where they're very passionate, deeply held emotional and ideological feelings about a decision. It's just a different process, and there's many more things to satisfy. There's much greater complexity. Maybe that background is useful. I hope we don't find out, but we'll see.
You joked with me in the green room a minute ago that I said, $1 a year. His salary is $1 a year. It means that was very good at his last job. And you said maybe we're being paid too much because of the way things are going right now. And not to dwell on that, but in a more constructive way, in taking a city like Chicago, which is one of the major leading lights, one of my favorite cities in the nation, how do you approach? You deal with finance, you deal with inclusion, you deal with so many of different levels of trying to change the climate here so that it's more welcoming, inclusive, that you've got more equitable investment. How do you think, how does this tick in your head? How do you move the needles that most matter and not just get distracted by many of the things that aren't contributing to that?
Well, look, I think the mayor, when he took office, was very clear and had a very clear vision of what mattered and what mattered in driving a city forward. And it really was those three things that even 5 years in, he's still very focused on: education, economic opportunity, and public safety. And as those sort of core essential services that sort of lead to a virtuous circle of making a place people want to be. Ultimately, to succeed as a city.
Going?
How are those things going?
Like the public safety thing.
I think there's a mix. Public safety is probably, first of all, they're all deeply interrelated to a degree that I don't think has been historically understood or appreciated and focused on in that way. So the reality is, if we aren't doing a good job in terms of economic opportunity throughout Chicago, in all neighborhoods, and in all walks of life, then public safety is threatened. If you're not doing a good educational job, if you have an education system that fails a segment of the population, and that doesn't lead to them being able to take economic opportunity, that's going to circle in a downward spiral in terms of public safety. Equally, if you do the right things, and if you fix public education and you lead to better results, say in K through 12, and then you extend that into a successful city college or university system, and that leads to a better prepared workforce that is actually engaging in the economy in a successful way, that's going to lead to a better public safety result, more than more cops alone or better gun control and a whole series of things that are very important, but at the end, I think that circle has to be complete. And that's what we've tried to focus on, sometimes very successfully. I think we've made a lot of strides in the educational realm. I think maybe threatened a little bit by what's going on in terms of funding. We've made a lot of strides in the economic development realm. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of extending it throughout the city. And public safety, it's been an ebb and flow. We've had some very good periods in which the city's been as safe as it's probably been in the last 30 and 40. And I think we've had some periods where it's been tougher.
When you look at your morning dashboard, do you have a dashboard? Do you have sort of a data, like how many fires there are, how many? Because I asked Raman this once, and he says he's a data dashboard kind of guy. And
he is more than I am.
You are?
I think, and it's sort of just a difference in personality, particularly in what I do.
So you're not a data guy, and he is?
No, I am, but I think less of day to day. I think in what I try to do and what I try to focus on, and maybe provide a bit of a be a useful counterpoint or a useful aid to him, is to take a slightly longer view, and I'm not elected. I don't have to worry every day.
You're like Michael J. Fox in that old sitcom, right? That when Michael J. Fox was deputy mayor of New York, and you have the real power, right? Not accountable, and
I don't even remember the show.
Oh, I do. I watched it last night just to get ready for this.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Better than watching Boss or Veep or Parks and Rec.
Yeah, exactly.
That's probably more real life.
I am interested in dashboards. I've asked a number of mayors about them because it gives a sort of sense of how they prioritize, the different tasks. Like Mayor Mike Rawlings of Dallas, on his dashboard that he's having created, he interestingly has property values as part of it. And looking at the south of Dallas, much like the south of Chicago, which hasn't been has been underdeveloped, underinvested in, and as he sees, prices rise, he knows something is beginning to go right. But in the dashboard, it's not all government that runs a city. Private firms, corporate investment, corporate partnership play a role. And I'm trying to ask a question that's not a feel-good question here, because you could say, oh, how's the corporate community in Chicago? Tell me about what's not good about the corporate community in Chicago. What are they not doing that they ought to stand up and do?
I think I'd start with a different spot, which is Chicago is enormously blessed with probably, and I've spent time working in almost every major financial capital in the world on transactions at various points in my career, and Chicago is unique. I've never experienced anything else like it in terms of the close interrelationship and working relationship between business, government, and the public sector, the nonprofit sector. And it's really quite remarkable, an unusual degree of cooperativeness and a sense of civic engagement. So we start with that. The reality is business has, and in particularly if you look at it over the last 10, 20, 30 years, 30 years ago, a large corporation in Chicago had the luxury of being able to focus on where it was headquartered. Executives lived here. They didn't travel. They probably traveled maybe a day or two a week.
Right.
They were largely here. They lived their lives here. They were likely to stay. They were going to live their whole career with a company. That was their investment and focus. In today's world, if you are the senior executive of a major Chicago corporation, and we're incredibly lucky that it is still a headquarters city. So, and in fact, over the last 5 years, we've had 40 headquarters of major companies move here. So we're still attracting companies to be based here, which is very, very valuable. But the senior executives of any large company have to be outwardly focused, have to be thinking about the rest of the world. They might sleep here on weekends, but the reality is if you're the executive of any big company, you're going to travel 3-4 days a week. You're elsewhere in the world. You have constituencies you have to worry about around the globe. So you can't be as focused on Chicago as you used to be. And we have to recognize that in terms of how we engage.
So you have to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, well, no, I think in terms of how we engage the private sector, what we expect out of them, and what we can use them to do realistically, and how they can engage in building a civil society in Chicago, I think is a little different than it would have been had I been doing this 20 or 30 years ago. My own, I lived here for 30 years and was here on weekends. I traveled 3, 4, 5 days a week. So my business career was really elsewhere in the globe, even though I lived here. And I think that's just not that uncommon in today's world. And in terms of using the business sector as part of sort of growing a better city, you have to be cognizant of the external pressures that exist on them.
So your view then, in terms of these partnerships and civic responsibility from the private sector, is that you've already got enough leadership there, that not more is needed, that it's sort of happening in an ecosystem without greater demand?
Well, look, money is better. Send money. Money's good. So we'd love to get more, private sector philanthropy, contribution, investment. Time, I'd say we get an enormous amount of time commitment from both the business community and the nonprofit community. I don't know that I'd ask for more time. I think what increasingly is important, and you'd always like to see more, and where I'd say the area that could do more is whether it's investment or in business consciousness of just trying to engage more. Look, there are cities that have done a great job, Cleveland comes to mind, of focusing the business community on buying local. So large corporations who use their supply chain to enhance small business in the immediate community, and we're trying to do more of that. I think that's a very important thing in today's world. I think, the corporate community has to do a better job and can do a better job of engaging the whole city. People tend to be focused on where they live, where they work, where they travel to, but they probably, don't think as much about the parts of the city that aren't part of their immediate realm. And that's a huge challenge for us over the next 5-10 years of making sure that what is successful in a city, and I think this is a challenge that every major city faces, how you distribute wealth, how you bring the economic success that exists right out here. You look out on Michigan Avenue or this park out in front of us or even the surrounding area, and there's enormous economic vibrancy and activity happening there. My challenge, and I think the challenge of any great city, is to figure out how to engage all the city in that success. And there's where I think we've done some interesting things. I think we have a lot to go, and that's where we're really trying to focus sort of public policy over the next several years.
I guess my last question, I'll go to the audience for a question or two, is about that full city. And let's just be blunt. The black community and the Hispanic community in Chicago were upset with the mayor over an interim police chief. You've been working hard to help the black community have greater access for small business support and small business funds. Why is all of this in the realm of identity sort of getting addressed now? How is this legacy of bias in the system produce such crappy results over such a long period of time and I guess the deeper question is, what do you do about it that doesn't look fake, artificial, and token?
Look, you're more of an expert in this than I am. I just, as an observer of national politics and local politics, would say we seem to be in a moment where identity has bubbled up to a much greater degree than it might have been 5 or 10 years ago. And people come from a spot of identity and say, that leads me to have this problem or want to be recognized. So we're dealing with that the same way most of the country is. You look at it in the presidential race or in any of our national political issues, it's very much a point. We have our own unique Chicago issues, which is historically Chicago has had a relatively high degree of residential segregation. I'd say we've had a slightly lower degree of economic segregation, but a very high degree of residential segregation. That's led to some persistent, very difficult social ills that we have to confront and we have to do better and we have to address. If we don't, we will fail.
Do you feel it's happening?
I think it is happening. I think it's happening just slowly, and it happens too slowly for any normal person's patience. And I just don't think we have a ton of time. There's an enormous urgency to get this right. And, I was struck by when somebody was talking earlier, they said Chicago has the same issues of, unemployment. Chicago actually has a relatively low, in fact, I think we still have the lowest unemployment rate overall of any major American city. But that data really hides the real problem. We have a terrific, very good employment situation in certain parts of the city and an abysmal and unconscionable unemployment rate in other parts of the city. So until we do something to do a better job of including all neighborhoods, everybody in the Chicago economy, then we're going to have a real problem.
Fascinating. Let me take one question. If we've got a question in the audience, we're right out of time here. Where's Christy Hefner? Right there, Christy.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, but you're...
All right, I will ask.
But I know you, and I know you're out there, and the world is watching, Christy.
So I think one of the challenges that government faces is the difficulty that voters have in distinguishing between investment and expense. And as you were talking, Steve, about one of the things you try and do as a ballast, establishing a reasonable time horizon that in the private sector you would have for investment and return on investment. What do you think both the business community and government can do better to help set that table in a way that, whether it's a decision like the parking meter decision, or whether it's a decision about not understanding the deferral of pension liability problems, we are more likely to get better outcomes because voters are more likely to understand what's at stake.
Or broad infrastructure. We've got 45 seconds. So.
Wow, in 45 seconds? Yeah. I think it's actually incredibly simple and incredibly difficult. Most people don't pay enough attention to politics, public life, to elections, and they do not hold public officials accountable. And the reality is there's an enormous reward in American public life for being short-sighted, for giving candy now and not worrying about the cavities later. That's reality. That is what happened in Chicago. For many, many years, we didn't pay our bills. It's not overly complicated. You have to pay your bills eventually, or else you're going to hit the wall. We hit the wall. We're dealing with that now.
Just as we close, Steve, if again, in the spirit of the city maker's idea, I've often thought about if we were to build a city from ground up today, and you were able to change any particular thing, we just made you all powerful, either within the city bureaucracy or within the way the city was designed. What's the biggest thing you would shift, given what you now know about running a place like this, that would make it better?
Wow. I don't know. I'm not sure I would shift anything, because I have become a believer that sort of the intense planning and intensely planned communities aren't actually places I would want to live. I don't want to live in, Celebration, Florida, or these like perfectly manicured. The chaos of cities, the sort of
Embrace
richness
chaos.
of, the layers that
tweetable,
come over
folks.
time. I think
Embracing
are what make a
chaos.
city fun.
Yeah.
Would you really want to live in that sort of
Not
well-planned
at all.
world? No.
Margaret Lowe Smith knows I wouldn't. Ladies and gentlemen, Deputy Mayor Steve Koch, thank you so much. That was fun.
Thanks so much.